Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Peter McDermott. You are very welcome to this talk by Dr. Brendan Kelly, who's Professor of Psychiatry in Trinity College, Dublin. Can I just double check that everyone can hear me? Forgot to do that. Yes, thank you very much for the thumbs up. I'm a lecturer in drama in the TU Dublin Conservatoire, and Dr. Kelly's talk today is part of our Stages of Memory project, which is looking into the history of Grangegorman, which is where we are based. Grangegorman as a site of mental health care, asylum, and incarceration. There are 3 talks in this series. Last week we had Dr. Christina Henry, a Tasmanian artist who created an installation about the history of the site. And next Thursday, the 12th at 5 p.m., we have Brian Donnelly, who is senior archivist with the Irish National Archives, who spent many years with the Grangegorman Archive. Our Stages of Memory project will culminate in a theatre production next December with the final year students on the Honours BA in Drama Performance here. We are very grateful to the Grangegorman Development Agency and the Grangegorman Histories Project for giving us a generous grant to commission a professional playwright to write a play with our students for that production. Thank you particularly to Philip Cohen and Aisling Roach from the Grangegorman Histories Project for their support and their hard work in making that happen. Thank you to them, as well as the TU Dublin Conservatoire, for enabling these talks to happen. So, without further ado, I will introduce Dr. Brendan Kelly, who is Professor of Psychiatry at Trinity College, Dublin, and he's the author, most recently, of the book In Search of Madness, A Psychiatrist Travels Through the History of Mental Illness, which was just published in April by Gill Books. And if you want more information about that book, you can go to gillbooks.ie, which is gillbooks.ie, and I'll put that link in the chat box after Dr. Kelly starts his talk. So without further ado, please over to Dr. Brendan Kelly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. And maybe you can give me a thumbs up, Peter, if I am audible and okay. So keep that thumb at the ready. I'm about to try and share my screen, another fairly major undertaking. How are we doing with screen sharing there, Peter? That's another thumbs up there. Brilliant. Well, look, thank you very much again for having me here. I'm going to talk a little bit for about 40 minutes or so about Grangegorman and aspects of the history of Grangegorman that really relate to the treatment of mental illness, or, you know, the function that the institution served, which does not always map onto the treatment of mental illness, to say the very least. Some of it is going to be based on this, as Peter said, which came out the other day. And I guess you should say at the start that I'm going to talk about mental illness and psychological distress and some of the treatments that were used in the past and some of the institutional practices that emerged in these institutions. So some people might find the content of this a little bit intense. Some people might find it a little bit distressing, maybe some of the topics. So feel free to tune out and tune back in as needed yourself, because I do talk through some aspects of the history that are, you know, upsetting and you know, and if you like, appropriately upsetting in institutions like this. So what I'm going to do is start with a little bit about the beginning of these large psychiatric hospitals and how they grew in the 1800s. I'm going to talk about 2 particular medical figures in the history of Grangegorman, and then take us a little bit up to the present day. But to understand, you know, the magnitude of this, we need to go back before there was an institution in Grangegorman. Now, I think some of you, many of you study in, work in, or are linked with TU Dublin in some way. So you'll be familiar with the campus in Grangegorman as it currently is. And, you know, it's very beautiful. If there's anyone here who was involved in the regeneration of the site, you know, it's unmistakably an old institution with buildings all over the campus on both sides of that road, but the work that's been done is interesting. And for someone like me who used to work from time to time in St. Brendan's Hospital, as it was called, and I saw how run down it was. I saw prefabs, I saw all kinds of things. There is a certain sadness with seeing how beautiful the buildings and the grounds could have been for all those years when it served as a psychiatric hospital. It's good to see it restored now. But look, let's go back to the very beginning. Let's go back to before we built lots of institutions and look at what happened to people with mental illness or madness or lunacy, or all these old terms that I'll be using and not endorsing for today, but I will be using them as I talk. So in 1817, before we built most of these hospitals, a committee of the House of Commons inquired into what happened to, if you like, the lunatic poor. And here's some of the evidence that they got. They said, when a strong, this is evidence from an MP, and it pertains to County Mayo, where there was no institution at this time. And they spoke about a person who was mentally ill, I think, or lunacy or madness was the phrase used, which I've changed here. And the evidence was that when a strong man or woman gets the complaint, that's lunacy in the language of the times, the only way the family have to manage is by making a hole in the floor of the cabin, not high enough for the person to stand up, with a crib over it to prevent his getting up. This hole is about 5 feet deep, and they give this wretched being his food here, and there he generally dies. So sometimes one comes across almost an historical fantasy that before institutions were built, people with mental illness or people with intellectual disability or people who were different were somehow cared for in communities. But evidence from all over the world is very, very clear that there was constraint and restraint constantly, not just in Ireland and across Europe, but in the Americas, through the Islamic world, in many, many places. The routine care was confinement at home. So again, with this picture and increased industrialization and people with mental illness becoming, if you like, more bothersome on the streets of towns and cities, a move began in the 1800s to build institutions to put them in. Now, the theory underlying these institutions, and I do emphasize the word theory, was outlined in this in a number of books. The best Irish example is this book from 1810, written by an enterprising asylum doctor in Cork called William Halloran. He built a public and a private institution in Cork in the 1790s, so ahead of Grangegorman. And he was one of these people who believed in what was termed moral management. And this meant that treating insanity, to use the word in his book title, was done in an institution, that there had to be a relationship between doctor and patient. In other words, they had to talk about things. The environment should be therapeutic, and an institution was considered therapeutic. Segregation was considered therapeutic. There was an emphasis on a particular diet, an emphasis on exercise, and an emphasis on occupation, being busy. So this was the idea. Now, a lot of these ideas, if you like, have recurred in various forms, but these relatively enlightened notions were here at the start of institutions. So Halloran's 1810 textbook, along with apparent increasing rates of insanity, prompted the Richmond Asylum to be built. It was founded in 1810, opened in 1814, and that is what we now know as Grangegorman. It had many different names, the Grangegorman Lunatic Asylum, and eventually it became St. Brendan's Hospital. But it started out as the Richmond Asylum, and it was the first of the big public asylums. There was the institution in Cork predating it, but soon these things proliferated all over the country. And while I've mentioned In Search of Madness, my own book, there is a really good book, another book that came out last year by Patrick Quinlan, published by UCD Press, about these institutions, and it's well worth a look. Really beautiful photography, really insightful take and account of these big institutions and where they are now. And I'm not certain if that's the same Patrick Quinlan I saw admitted there to this talk, but it makes no difference. It's a really beautiful book anyway, and it really gives a feel for the magnitude of this project, what was being undertaken, and how the buildings were designed in order to try and, if you like, implement this moral management. So that's basically how the institutions, if you like, became established. Now, there are other ways of telling the story to do with institutions in general and societies, particularly Irish societies, reliance on institutions of all descriptions to solve all kinds of social problems and awkwardness. We seem to have a fatal weakness for building institutions in an effort to sort out various problems. And what happens, of course, is they move out of control very, very quickly. So Grangegorman then, it was established in 1810, it opened at its first patients in 1814, and then it just grew and grew. Initially, it was directed by moral governors. These were people who were not doctors. They managed the institution, they were in charge. Two of them there weren't doctors, and they oversaw the treatments. Now, the treatments that were offered varied considerably, but I'll just give one example here. There was an emphasis on water, the use of water and showers as a form of treatment. And this is a diagram of people used to be given, just freezing cold showers 3 and 4 times a day. And this was thought to be therapeutic in terms of shock. It gave people a startle or a shock, and this idea of shock is going to recur again. But this, for example, was one of the treatments certainly used. There was also something called the bath of surprise, which is when someone was abruptly plunged into a vat of cold water. Again, the idea of a physiological shock being therapeutic. So the moral governors were in charge until around 1857, and then medical superintendents, that's the doctors, if you like, were put in charge. But all through the time, you had this institution that was growing enormously. And here's an image of 1854, 40 years after the Richmond opened, and it's now called the Richmond District Lunatic Asylum. And like all these institutions, it has become very, very big at this point. Just it expanded, and the emphasis shifted from caring for individual patients to managing this huge institution. To give you some feel for the problems, each year maybe between 10 and 12% of all the patients would die of an infectious disease, commonly TB at certain points. So these were huge unhygienic institutions housing all kinds of people with a very high mortality rate, a high death rate. Other treatments, and this one might be of particular interest to this audience, in the 1850s, 1860s, Dr. Joseph Lawler, decided that education and training were the most valuable treatments, and that education, and particularly literacy, formed the basis of moral treatment of all classes of the insane. So people were being educated to read, to write, but also to work in crafts and work on the land. Now, the asylum had a farm, as most did at the time, and the patients would work on, would work, and this is very problematic and sort of ethically problematic. There can be therapeutic value in work, but there can also be exploitation in work. And we find this, I find this a lot as you go around Ireland talking in the various towns which had large mental hospitals. You often find families had farms where maybe a man would show up and work and then go away in the evening, and the children would never know where he came from or where he went to, and would later discover he was coming out of Ballinasloe, for example, to work on the farm, out of St. Bridget's, and then going back in. And of course, some of these people, for them, working got them out of the institution, and it was good, it gave value and meaning, but in many, many cases, it was exploitative, unpaid labor. And that's a very, very difficult part of the history of these institutions. But in any case, a lot of the rhetoric that has survived is positive, and here's some of it, with Dr. Lawler saying that education and training were the basis of the moral treatment, and that's in the 1860s. One of the big problems, particularly at Grangegorman, is this notion that there was an increase of insanity in Ireland, that rates of mental illness were increasing uncontrollably, and there was almost a panic reaction to this. The number of certified lunatics in Ireland, and again, I apologize for the terminology here, increased by 60% between 1875 and 93, and by less than 22% in England and Wales. But of course, what was happening in Ireland is large hospitals were being built and they were immediately full. We know this about institutions. Once you build them, they will be filled. So it seems to me that we did not have an epidemic of insanity, but we had an epidemic of mental hospitals. And the importance of these institutions to their local communities cannot be overstated. There were huge sources of employment. They were economic powerhouses for the towns they were located in. Again, going back to Ballinasloe, in the 1940s, the town had a population of about 5,600 people. And of those 5,600 people, 2,100 were patients in St. Bridget's, the mental hospital. So obviously, if 2,100 out of 5,600 are patients, pretty much everyone else either works in the institution, supplies it, has a family member who is somehow connected with it or in it as a patient. So the number of so the towns, these were very important institutions, and I think maybe at the questions and answers, if that is indeed Patrick Quinlan, he might have some perspectives on this based on his study of the buildings. So we get to the end of the 1800s then with these very, very large institutions, and a lot of local energy invested in keeping them open, keeping them big, and a lot of very subtle use of the institutions. So, for example, there was a phenomenon, and I see it again and again in the archives, a phenomenon called wintering in, whereby a family might have someone who was maybe mentally ill, maybe intellectually disabled, maybe just awkward and difficult. And they'd leave that person into the mental hospital at the start of winter, take them out at the end of summer so they could work on the farm, and then put them back in again for the winter. So you had communities using these institutions in very subtle ways to meet their family needs or their community needs. And I'm always a bit annoyed when I hear people talk about hidden institutions, because if ever anything was hidden in plain sight, it was these. Everyone knew where they were, you couldn't miss them, and everyone knew they were full of people. And there, a number of things were keeping them going. I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the people who tried to change the situation at Grangegorman, Dr. Connolly Norman, a very interesting figure, who was resident medical superintendent up until his sudden death in 1908. And he when he came to Grangegorman, he inherited this enormous institution. Like, it had its own fire brigade, so large was it, and I suppose so great was the risk of fire. It had its own cricket team, among many other sports. And if you look at the map here, you can see the Richmond Lunatic Asylum indicated here. I don't know if you can see my arrow moving around on the screen. If you can see my arrow moving around, can someone give me a thumbs up? Because I don't want to be referring to, yeah, lovely, thanks.
Yes,
thanks.
yes, we can see it.
Thanks, William. So you had the Richmond Lunatic Asylum here, this building. But what's really, really interesting how it developed is you had the workhouse, the North Dublin Union workhouse as well. And you had the penitentiary. And I know you heard about the penitentiary. I know you heard about these institutions, and when you track people moving between them, you had people moving particularly from the workhouse and to the asylum and back, often for reasons that aren't entirely clear from the records. I know that broadly speaking, the food was considered better in the asylum compared to the workhouse. So you had a network of institutions, and you also had the other hospitals down here. You had a fever hospital, and you had the Richmond Hospital, that red brick building that served as a courthouse. So you had a cluster of institutions, of which the asylum formed part. And there it is. And you'll be familiar with the traces of these buildings, no doubt, still. And here's another map. You can see here the church. That church is still there now, beautifully restored. The clock tower area up here, and this older edifice, and linking here with the workhouse, the North Union workhouse. And you know, when Connolly Norman was resident medical superintendent, about 1/3 of all admissions to the asylum came directly from the workhouse, which wasn't at all surprising, given the closeness of the two institutions. Then you had the Whitworth Hospital, the Richmond, and the Hardwick Fever Hospital, all in a little cluster there. Most extraordinary part of the city, and very, very rich in its troubled and troubling history. You know, ironically, the North Dublin Union, you know, there's a homeless hostel, and certainly when I worked in the Mater Hospital, 1/3 of our psychiatric presentations came straight from that homeless hostel. That was in 2007, exactly 100 years after Connolly Norman noted the precisely the same thing going on, with admissions coming straight into the asylum from the workhouse. So the asylum sent a committee to visit North Dublin Workhouse to see what was going on, and they found that the workhouse was indeed even worse than the asylum. The female ward in the workhouse was little more than a dungeon. The ventilation was inadequate. It was repellent, as was the idea is that these places would be repellent, so people wouldn't want to go into them. People were being spoon-fed, and of course, the committee rather unhelpfully concluded that all the lunatic inmates in the workhouse should immediately be brought to the asylum. You know, and there's a picture from the workhouse, thus making the overcrowding even worse. But what Connolly Norman tried to do was something called boarding out. He developed this idea that many of the patients in Grangegorman didn't need to be there, and he was undoubtedly correct. And he tried to set up a scheme whereby they could be boarded out in houses, either their own or someone else's, for periods of time at least, in order to decant them from the clearly unhealthy environment of the overcrowded Grangegorman. But this was absolutely blocked by Dublin Castle at the time. There was enormous local investment in having large institutions, and scaling them down was not going anywhere. Also, families weren't always able to take people home. One of the things I've come across in Grangegorman records and elsewhere is letters from medical superintendents to families saying, you know, I'm thinking of one particular letter from Omagh Asylum to a family saying, you know, your family member has now been well in the asylum here for over a year, please come and take him home. And then a letter back from the family saying, you know, dear doctor, thank you. We are delighted he is well. However, we are not in a position to take him home. It is best he stay in the asylum. Please write to us again after he dies. So you had families who were in very tough positions, maybe owing to poverty, owing to other difficulties within their family, who weren't able to take someone home. And the only solution being offered was this institution. So Connolly Norman made various efforts to scale it down, but it basically failed, to put it very, very bluntly. Although he is one of only 2 psychiatrists or asylum doctors mentioned in Ulysses. For aficionados of Joyce, on page 6 or 7, usually 6, Connolly Norman is mentioned, and Grangegorman is referred to as Dottyville. But one area where Connolly Norman did have some success, and I do want to emphasize this person, is with one of his junior colleagues, a person called Dr. Eleanor Fleury. Now, she is a figure who is not celebrated as much as she should be, And certainly if there are students interested in a really good story or historical project, Eleanor is very worthy of it. This is Dr. Connolly Norman here, a fine mustache on him. And this is Dr. Fleury, who came to work as a more junior doctor in Grangegorman. And at the time, to become a fully fledged asylum doctor, you needed to be a member of the Medical Psychological Association. That was the Association of Asylum Doctors, and that only admitted men. But in 1893, Connolly Norman rather mischievously and subversively applied to get Eleanor Fleury made into a member. It was clearly against the rules. It was rejected, but he then managed to get the rules changed, and she was admitted as a full member the following year in 1894, making her the first that we're aware of, certainly the first woman psychiatrist in the Medical Psychological Association, which was Ireland, England, Wales, and Scotland. We can't find an earlier one admitted to a professional association anywhere else in the world, but it would be so interesting if somebody could. So Eleanor Fleury, however, for usual kind of reasons, didn't succeed Connolly Norman as resident medical superintendent in Grangegorman, but she was appointed to the sister, the branch asylum, St. Ita's in Portrane, which you can see here. Just a huge institution built around 1900, and fascinatingly, it was the largest building contract ever awarded by the state. It was awarded to a hospital. It went vastly over cost, over budget, behind time, and questions were constantly asked about it in Parliament. Now, certain listeners might find that this reminds them of a more recent hospital building project in this country. The parallels are uncanny. On the plus side, it got built and it operated for a century. So I don't know what to take from that. Anyway, Eleanor Fleury worked out here, and she was of like a lot of the local asylums and people who worked in them, she was of a rather politically revolutionary frame of mind. And when she worked in Grangegorman, she used to hide Republican fugitives in her house and treat them for their injuries. And when she moved out to Portrane, she used to hide fugitives in Portrane. And as you can see there, it's it's a great place for hiding people. And she used to treat them and so on. And I'm just going to give an example of one witness statement from the military archives about how Portrane and Grangegorman were used politically. Free State troops would swoop on Portrane, this is, and the men on the run, these are the people that Eleanor Fleury was hiding out in the institutions. They used to go out into the grounds and were mistaken for mental patients. So they used to try and blend in with the patients when the Free State troops tried to put an end to Fleury's activities. Mr. Cosgrave's government found out about this, and indeed Eleanor Fleury was interned for 6 months in, ironically, part of the, in Broadstone, just beside Grangegorman there. But Mr. Cosgrave's government spoiled everything. They found out about it and took measures to end this use of the asylums. But it's an unwritten part of the history of Grangegorman, its subversion, and there are loads of other examples of this, but it was such a big institution and it was very politically powerful. The big analogy here is with St. Bridget's in Ballinasloe, where another asylum doctor, Ada English, was a member of Cumann na mBan, got elected to the second Dáil when she was in prison in Galway, was fiercely anti-treaty. And what she used to do was, the asylum was a big employer, so she would give lifelong jobs to any man who left the RIC. So if she could persuade you, she'd give you a job in St. Bridget's if you'd leave the RIC, the Royal Irish Constabulary. So she too was using the institution for political purposes. You know, the sheer size of the place made this possible, no more than Eleanor Fleury's activities. But apart from that, Fleury was a leader and very much deserves more attention. She, like Connolly Norman, is buried in Mount Jerome. Anyway, right, so we're at Grangegorman. We're moving into the 1900s now. And of course, at this point, Ireland has these huge mental hospitals. There's a really good paper in Studies in 1924, written by Edward Boyd Barrett. And Barrett writes about all of the asylums, now not just Grangegorman. They're in a bad way. Now this is 1923, Ireland has more people per head of population in mental hospitals than any country before or since. The asylums are in a bad way. They're overcrowded, they're understaffed, all kinds of patients are herded together. There's no treatment, cures are at a very low figure, public money is wasted. The asylums are unsuitable in every respect. So there were similar pictures around the world. Ireland wasn't unique, but our asylums grew faster and bigger than anywhere else per head of population. So into this rather dispiriting situation at Grangegorman comes a Professor John Dunn, a very complicated, again, very political figure who he works there in the 1920s, but comes back as resident medical superintendent and in charge of the institution for nearly 30 years. So an absolutely pivotal figure in the history of Grangegorman. And Dunn was horrified at the state of the institution he inherited. Full of people, grossly unhygienic, very high death rate, almost impossible to discharge people. And this impulse to sort this out led to a succession of treatments being introduced, which I go into in some depth in the book, In Search of Madness, but I want to talk a bit about them now. In the 1920s, when Dunn was here in Grangegorman, he introduced something called malaria therapy. Now, malaria therapy is a very interesting idea, which is that you take patients who are in the asylum who have general paralysis of the insane, GPI. It's basically advanced syphilis affecting the brain. And it was a problem in the asylums that in order to treat these people who had this advanced syphilis of the brain, what you did was you gave them malaria. You made them ill with malaria. And then you treated the malaria with quinine. And as the malaria got better, so too did their tertiary syphilis. So too did their so-called mental illness, which really was advanced syphilis. So this idea was formulated by a guy called Wagner Joreg, and it spread across Europe. And Dunn, seized with the size of the institution, decided to try this, and he got mosquitoes brought in. He used to collect them down at the customs and bring them up, but the mosquitoes don't bite, apparently, in a chilly country like Ireland, so it didn't work. So instead, he took to getting serum, blood, from malaria patients in London and injecting that into people with general paralysis of the insane. Now, this treatment, which really has very scant basis in any kind of science. The evidence is that it did in fact reduce the death rate from general paralysis of the insane. So prior to this treatment in Grangegorman, about 24 patients died every year from the condition. But after this, only around 4 or 5 died each year. And that seems to be replicated around the world. And there is some basis for the idea that an infectious illness can cure this condition. However, penicillin put an end to the whole thing, because penicillin can be now used to treat the underlying condition. But this whetted Dunn's appetite, and he introduced a succession of what were called physical methods of treatment. And he published a paper about this in 1950. I'm not going to talk about all of them. Insulin coma was another one, but I am just going to mention one called lobotomy, which was brain surgery. And this is undoubtedly the single greatest tragedy in psychiatry. And, the idea of brain surgery isn't actually an outrageous one in itself, but what is absolutely appalling is the way that this was tried. It didn't work, but it wasn't stopped. And a lot of this is attributable to the asylum doctors of the time, who desperately wanted to empty their huge institutions. And Walter Freeman The procedure was really pioneered by a Portuguese guy called Moniz, who won a Nobel Prize for lobotomy, but it was popularized by an American Dr. Walter Freeman. And here's a picture of Freeman doing a lobotomy in the States. It was performed here in Ireland. John Dunn introduced it to Grangegorman for severe patients who'd been in the institution for a long time. The surgeries were performed in the Richmond Hospital, which is that red brick building, just some of you might know it. It was a courtroom for a while. But Dunn, as I say, he published the results from all these treatments. And that really was his big strength, because he was not impressed by lobotomy. He felt it did not help most people who underwent it, even when he reserved it for the more severe patients who had been in institutions for years and were violently disturbed. He should have stopped it sooner. Everyone should have stopped it sooner, but it just went on and on. And here's perhaps the most famous example is John F. Kennedy's sister, Rosemary, who had a lobotomy in 1941. And she does appear to have had some kind of maybe behavioral problems or something, but her father consented to the procedure without telling her mother, and it was disastrous. She was severely disabled by it for the rest of her life, and spent the rest of her life institutionalized. The big problem was that there were no long-term outcome studies with lobotomy to indicate the ultimate outcomes, which were bad. Now, weirdly, some people did benefit from lobotomy as well. And the history of psychiatry is full of this narrative and counter-narrative. You know, I know when a colleague of mine, Dr. Maurice Guray, published an article about lobotomy once in the newspaper, he got 2 letters back, both from people who'd had lobotomies for obsessive compulsive disorder and said it cured it. But of course, these are testaments from those who survive. And systematically, lobotomy was a disaster, carried on for far longer than it should have been. And that's clear as day. Those of you researching the history of Grangegorman and these treatments, there's a book by Joseph Reynolds that's hopefully in the TU Dublin Library. It's very hard to find at the moment, but it's a very interesting book with a lot of good facts. And it talks about treatments like electroconvulsive therapy, which was introduced in 1942, again by John Dunn. And again, he published outcomes with it, showing that it didn't seem to help anybody except people with severe depression. So a really interesting paper from 1950 showing a good deal of insight. And Dunn's, you know, if you like, the problem in Grangegorman during the Dunn era was his enthusiasm for the treatments, but this was tempered by his always publishing outcomes from the treatments at Grangegorman, which led the way in these things in Ireland. The bottom line, of course, however, is that there was this steady institutionalization in Ireland. By 1961, 1 in 70 Irish people was in a psychiatric hospital. Now, what's very interesting to me in this story are some of the things that did not happen in this history at Grangegorman or anywhere. One of them is that psychoanalysis, Freud's theories, which had a huge impact in the rest of the world, barely even registered here in Ireland. We had no appetite for psychoanalysis. And that's something someone can reflect upon. I reflect upon it at length, and I won't subject you to that now. The other thing that didn't happen is that the Roman Catholic Church did not run the asylums. It supplied chaplains, but it didn't run the institutions. So when you think about it, at their peak, there was around 20,000 people in mental hospitals in Ireland, and that's more than double the number that were in all other institutions combined. If you add up the Magdalene laundries, the mother and baby homes, orphanages, industrial schools, prison, the whole lot, the asylums tended to be double the size. Now, all those other institutions have correctly been the subject of inquiries and investigations because of what went on in them. But it seems to me that the reason our largest institutions have been ignored is because the usual narrative that's applied to Irish history now, which is that the church is responsible for almost all the negative things in recent history, And it is responsible for a lot of them, just to be absolutely clear, but not all. We were more than capable of institutionalizing vast numbers of people without the involvement of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, that is not a very popular story or popular narrative at the moment. However, it's true, and the mental hospitals are testament to this. And if you've time and questions and answered, I'd be so much interested about this. So along to this huge institution, and just as unnerved by it as Dunn was Ivor Brown, a psychiatrist who, along with Dermot Walsh, oversaw the systematic dismantling of Grangegorman, the taking down of walls, the closing of wards and buildings. This is a complicated process. Many people had been in there so long that if you talk about care in the community, that was their community, if you know what I mean, at that point in their life. So moving people out is a complex process. But I suppose the key thing is not creating more people who were institutionally bound. Now, over those decades, Grangegorman, the older part, had fallen into disuse, and it was used as a setting in films in the 1980s, 1990s. A lot of it looked very nice from the outside, but inside, absolute decay. And so this is into the clock tower building, now very nicely restored. Those of you who are interested in the dying years of the institution, there's a really good movie. And again, it would be great if TU Dublin had this in its library. There's a 2001 film by John Carney called On the Edge, about a young man who is admitted to St. Brendan's Hospital as it used to look. And it's a very early film starring Cillian Murphy, the actor who's now gone on to many, many great things. And it's filmed on in the old St. Brendan's buildings toward the end of their days, peeling paint and linoleum coming off the floor. But of course, what appeals to me most in the film is the psychiatrist, Stephen Ray. And you can see him here. He wears some really nice jumpers, and he is actually one of the more human sides. It's a really nice story about trying to bring a certain bit of softness and humanity to what was a fairly cold institution even at that point. So we get to the end of the 1900s, where the large number in Grangegorman has now diminished greatly, and eventually, you know, from in 1906 there were 2,800 patients. But then by 2013, when it eventually closed, there was just 54 inpatients in there, which is really a big dismantling of a big institution. Now, there was a replacement healthcare facility, some of you will know it, the Phoenix Care Centre, but that is very, very much a smaller entity, and it runs along a different paradigm, but it is very much smaller. So what I wanted to do today is talk a little bit through some of the history, starting with the beginnings, that prior to building these institutions, it wasn't a utopian situation that some of the more fanciful histories or philosophers like to say. Things were difficult for people with mental illness, not so bad that the institutions were justified, but something did need to be done. And then in the 1800s, you had Grangegorman open in 1814 with the idea of moral management, but then it just grew and grew and grew uncontrollably, like institutions all over the place. And these were embedded in their communities, embedded in the way families functions, embedded in societies, economies. Very, very hard to undo that. Connolly Norman did give it a go and didn't get terribly far. And indeed, he died of a sudden heart attack in 1908, just on the North Circular Road there outside his house. He was attended to by a Dr. Stoker, Bram Stoker's brother, Sir William Thornley Stoker, but alas, Connolly Norman died. One of his legacies is this idea of boarding out, which he pretty much failed with, but he contributed to the literature in lots of other ways. And one thing he didn't do is become involved in eugenics, which was sweeping across Europe at the time. And one thing he did was promote Eleanor Fleury to achieve at least some more of her potential. And she is a figure that I would dearly love to see someone research and write a book about at some point. When the 1900s came, we had at Grangegorman this huge institution, which continued to grow, and it was being used for all kinds of complicated reasons and appeared to be growing unstoppably. in desperation, a series of treatments were introduced, including lobotomy, which was carried on for far too long. But the drive was to discharge people at all costs, cut down the size of the institution. But that really only happened with social change in the 1970s when Ivor Browne arrived. Ireland joined the EU, and broader things led to this change and deinstitutionalization in Ireland rather than any core medical change. And then we had the closure of St. Brendan's and its reinvention as TU Dublin, one of the more interesting reinventions of these old buildings around Ireland. Some are now hotels, and Patrick will know more about this than I. And I guess I've the future down there as a point. But I want to just finish with, well, I suppose mentioning the Grangegorman Histories project, which is looking at this history, and TU Dublin plays such an important role in this. But I just want to finish maybe by asking you to think of TU Dublin at Grangegorman today. If you just visualize it, the beautiful landscaping, the light, the lovely buildings, just the sense of openness. That's probably what it felt like when it opened in 1814. It was a beautiful institution, a beautiful building with grounds, but then it deteriorated quickly as institutional imperatives took over, as they always do. And maybe that's something to think about in the future. If other groups of people in society start getting institutionalized, you know, we saw this with the direct provision system, and we see it all over the place. Just that the salutary tale of our mental hospitals, how institutions will persist, they will grow, and they will find uses no matter what we do. That, however, is not the most important point of my talk. I think the most important point of my talk is the book, I guess. And I'm just going to leave that there for a minute until Peter, the chairperson, decides that it's too blatant and has to be stopped. Because I would be very keen for any questions, comments in the chat or live, or however Peter wants to work it. Because I'm aware, and listen, can I just finish? Can I have 1 more minute, Peter, actually? I just want to finish by saying I'm aware there are probably people in this audience with very specific perspectives on this. This is why I love to talk about it. People who work in TU Dublin, people who worked in St. Brendan's Hospital, people who had a family member in this or a similar institution, maybe people who have had a mental illness or have been in such a hospital, or people who are suffering, or people who are bereaved, or all kinds of things. These are complicated stories. I hope I haven't offended anyone in what I've said or upset anyone, and I'm very keen to hear. I know we have some historians who know a lot more than I about aspects of these, especially the buildings. So all of these stories matter. I've just shared my way of telling it, which is just my way.
Brendan, thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating.
Okay.
And incredible that you managed to get such a broad overview, yet with very, very specific details that gave us anchors in the different stages of the institution's sort of evolution, I suppose. One question just from our perspective, which would be useful, is, was there any point, because you mentioned to me before the talk that, you know, there was this common practice of not necessarily having any medical assessment, and people could be admitted without that, and it became more of a form of social control to admit a family member. Was there any point where specific medical criteria were implemented, and if so, what were they? What were some of them that actually was like, okay, yes, this person needs to be admitted, and no, this person doesn't?
Yeah, so that's really, really interesting, Peter, because you know, initially there was no need for a medical certificate, but often there was reliance on medical evidence anyway. And then I would like to believe that when sort of medical certification became a requirement, I would dearly love to be able to say that we made an enormous difference and that we ensured only people, who were maybe severely disturbed or mentally ill were admitted. But to be honest, we don't seem to have made a blind bit of difference to rates of admission at the time. The rates just continued to go up. There was a very unfortunate piece of legislation called the Dangerous Lunacy legislation, the Dangerous Lunacy Act. And this happened when a man who was released from the asylum shortly afterwards tried to assassinate a banker, right? Now, I have lived through an era when maybe trying to attack certain bankers would have been lauded by society rather than taken as a sign of lunacy. But at the time, a piece of legislation was rushed through the parliament to say that any person who appeared to be mentally ill and appeared to be about to commit a crime could be taken into custody by the police and transferred to an asylum. Now, this was very, very vague, and a practice grew of families or communities who were trying to get someone to put away, goading them into almost committing a crime. And then they would be taken to prison and they would have to be transferred to an asylum. There was no choice in the matter. And this low threshold became the dangerous lunatics, they were called. This became the admission pathway of choice because it gave the police responsibility for transporting the person. And they remained in prison until they were put in the asylum. Now, this was a problem because some people remained in prison for years because the asylum took the position they're not mentally ill, but they were waiting. So the law, that piece of legislation contributed hugely to the escalating rates of admission, and putting this low threshold in place created these strange institutional, if you like, imperatives. And that remained in place until the early 1900s. And Ireland had so many dangerous lunatics. I'm using the phrase now as it was legally, far more dangerous lunatics than anywhere in the world because the threshold was so incredibly low.
Okay, wow, thank you very much. I'm going to move to look to see what's in the chat, see if there are any questions there. And please, if people would like to use the raise the hand button, I can, we're going to change the view here so I can see where people are. Just a comment from Lynn Jeffries. The parallels from the beginning of Grangegorman and the way society was then to the way things are now are remarkable. Lots of thanks. Thomas Lawler, who was in last week, mentions that he had an elderly relative who was perfectly sane and lived in Grangegorman for many years, and she would not leave the ward even for an hour on a Sunday afternoon. So there's a little, yeah.
So, Peter, can I just mention something about the parallels, just speaking to the point about the dangerous lunacy legislation being used because it gave the police responsibility for taking the person away. In recent years here in Ireland, the past 5 or 10 years, involuntary psychiatric admission, our rates of involuntary admission in Ireland are very low, less than half the rate in England, but we have seen a trend which is more police involvement in recent years, because police involvement in involuntary psychiatric admission gives the police responsibility for transporting the patient now, just as it did in the 1800s. And in the past few years, we've seen an increase in police involvement in this process, which is extremely worrying, particularly if we take a very long historical view, which is concerning. And with regard to Mr. Lawler's comment, there are very many stories of elderly relatives who are perfectly sane and, were in the institutions for so long. And I think it's important to remember that keeping contact with them and even offering them opportunity to come out was of enormous value, because there were many people who didn't have anyone to even offer them opportunity to come out. The chaplain at St. Brendan's, who is now deceased, Father Adul, tells stories of funerals where he was the only person present. So any family who maintains some contact, that's probably was more valuable than you'll ever know.
Okay, thank you. I see Tanya Dean has a question as well. Tanya is my colleague here in the drama department. Tanya, if you wouldn't mind switching on your mic, and there you are.
Thank you so much, Pete. And thank you, Brendan. This is just such a fascinating history, and the way you tell it is very kind of human and engaging. My question was, I know with the publication of your recent book, you've had to negotiate with a kind of the delicate ethics of writing about archival materials about people who were in mental institutions, who are going through the most difficult time of their life for many of them. And I suppose from our perspective, working in the drama department, I'd love to ask for your thoughts on what are the kind of ethical responsibilities, but also opportunities for artists who are perhaps looking at stories like these.
Well, yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to fly through a few specific points on that, if you like. My feeling on it is, I guess I got a foot in different camps because I'm a psychiatrist, I'm a doctor, but I also write about history. I did a PhD in history at some point. So the first thing about the ethics is, I do think there is an ethical obligation to take these stories that are in the archival case records and to tell them and explore them in some way. The difficulty and complexity is secondary to that, in my view. And I think we should have a bias, or, you know, a tendency toward telling the stories. As a medical doctor, I am interestingly bound by medical confidentiality forever. If I read a story in a case history book, as I have from 120 years ago, I cannot use the person's name in anything that I do, nor anything that will identify them. However, that still leaves a great deal that is important that one can do, because often it's not the specific name of the person that matters. Like, I would like to tell their names. I would like to show their photos. I would like to publish the photo of someone and say, this person was locked away for 30 years. And look, it's not much, but here they are. Their picture, their name. I'm not allowed to do that because I'm a doctor. Other people might be allowed to do that if they're not bound by the medical council rules that I'm bound by. But there is vagueness in this area. What I can tell you, though, is we have recently in the HSE set up a group to coordinate the keeping and access to all mental hospital records, to introduce a unified standard for access and use. And we will likely have guidelines within a year, which will say, hopefully, that records over 100 years old are considered open and public. We're thinking. Now, it's not in place yet, so don't you know, but we're hoping. For now, access to the Grangegorman archive, which is based in the National Archives, is something Brian Donnelly will talk about, I think, next week. But basically, you apply to the National Archives and the HSE controls whether you access them or not. And the HSE decision maker, I've appointed a decision maker for that, which is me. So eventually your application gets to me and I would give you access, but we're still subject to anonymity for the moment. But we must not let that stop us taking these stories and telling them as best we can. Even if it means publishing photos with bits blocked out, we need to push it to the line because the stories weren't told at the time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
We're coming up to 6 o'clock, but I see that Patrick Quinlan has been waiting to come in, and I know he has some experience with this. So Patrick, it'd be great if you could switch on your mic. Thank you.
Yep. Can I be heard there?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, great. Brendan, thank you very much indeed. A fascinating tour. Lovely to hear you speak actually finally in person. Just a reflection, your reflection on the potential of what might have been when you see what Grangegorman is today, and it's something that resonated with me. And I had a question from your personal experience of having been involved in the institution kind of professionally over the years, particularly maybe in that rundown period. Buildings came to be seen as part of the problem, and there is that. Would you share the view? And actually, therefore, erasing them and getting rid of them, and I'm thinking especially of the upper house and chunks of the lower house, became almost a symbolic of progress. Is that something that you would have felt part of during your time there?
Yeah, I think what you're saying is absolutely true. You know, but you know, it was ironic the way that these things evolved, and I'm sure you came across lots of traces of this in your work, Patrick, which is you'd have this huge big building, and then all the patients crowded into a prefab at the back, where the building was deemed unrestorable or unusable or would cost too much, and it was quicker just to raise a prefab, which was absolutely appalling. I always felt the focus on buildings was holding so much back, and even the language of mental health care for so long, and in a way today is, do you have any beds? This is the thing, which is getting people into beds. And there was a really good talk by her name escapes me now, at TU Dublin a week or two ago, about the beds and the symbolism of getting people into beds, and hospitals were measured by the number of beds in them. And so, if you like, the furniture, the buildings, all of these became symbols that distracted us from the core, what should have been the core focus, which was the person's journey, or the patient, if you want to use that word, experience. So I think there's an awful lot in your point, and just to emphasize, I really liked the way that some of these themes were drawn out in your book, often not stated straight in your face, but very, very clear. I really liked, there was a subtlety to it, and to the images, Patrick. I've forgotten the name of the photographer now, but really, really wonderful.
Thank you for the kind comment. David Keane, I get happy to give him the plug. He did, yeah. Thank you very much, Brendan. Thank you.
Brendan, are you willing to take a few more questions?
Peter, we've an awful problem, which is that I would sit here until midnight talking about this. So it's going to be up to you. I'm sorry, but you're going to have to wield the stick. I'd be perfectly happy here.
Okay. Thank you very much. There's at least one more hand, and I think 2 or 3 questions in the chat box. So we'll just take those if that's okay. Maybe just another 10 minutes. I appreciate it. Lynn Jeffers, is it, or Jeffries? Sorry, I'm not sure. Lynn, if you wouldn't mind switching on your mic.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hi, thanks. Really informative talk. And I just wanted to ask a question to follow up on the comment I made about the parallels and your comment about kind of increased police intervention in mental health responses. And I wondered, I'm from Canada, and like in some places in North America, they have this kind of collaborative response between mental health teams and the police. And I wonder what your thoughts were on an Irish version of that, basically.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good point. So I mean, we've had in Ireland a reaction to our historical psychiatric institutions. We now have the 3rd lowest number of psychiatric beds in the EU. And our rate of involuntary admission sectioning, as it were, is less than half of that in England. Now, we pay a price for this, which is mentally ill people who are homeless and in prison. I mean, these are just such historical trends, like, you feel almost powerless in the face of them sometimes. We don't have joint police and mental health service responses, mainly because of staffing problems on the mental health side of things. However, revisions have been proposed to our Mental Health Act. And one of the proposed revisions is that if the police take someone into custody under the Mental Health Act, that the moment they get them into the police station, they need to call what's called an authorized officer of the health service down to see where to go. This was not the case at present. The policeman can make an application for involuntary admission at present. The proposed revisions to the legislation suggest that the police should not be allowed to do this anymore, that if someone is so ill that they take them into custody, they need to call an authorized officer from the health service, which would probably be a nurse, to come down and see, is this a mental health problem or is it not? Is it something else? So it won't reproduce the sort of joint crisis intervention that we see in parts of Canada and the US, but it will improve our situation a little bit by getting a little bit of mental health involvement early on, because to try and hopefully prevent involuntary admissions, particularly inappropriate ones that could be dealt with better outside of hospitals, but often the police genuinely don't have don't have the knowledge of the services available. So that's something we're trying to get put through, although the amendments we've proposed to the Mental Health Act are not prospering at the moment, unfortunately.
Hey,
Well, thanks very much for that.
Thank you, Lynn. I'm just going to add some of the comments in the chat box. This is from Anne. I moved to a cottage behind Grangegorman in 1980. One of the first times I drove down Rathdown Road, I saw a patient in pajamas with a suitcase running away from the hospital. I had an uncle who was a patient there for years, who came home from the Second World War, suffering from shell shock. He used to escape and get to Nace, where his sister lived at the time. From Ethna Muldoon, a super presentation. I grew up next door to a psychiatric hospital in the 1970s, and over time knew many of the patients by name. I attended a few of their funerals, which, it is true, were not well attended. There's from Christina Quinlan, very interesting. Thanks, Brendan. I think that you're too easy on the church, though. The hold it had over society and its edicts regarding what was acceptable and what was not. She mentions that she's written about Latin eugenics, which functioned through segregating people rather than, for example, engaging in sterilization, as was the practice in eugenics. The prevailing fear in relation to sex and licentious behaviors, illegitimacy, and how all of this was policed. So those are just a few comments.
Peter, can I chip in briefly there on that one?
Please,
I certainly do take her point, and I know that Fintan O'Toole, for example, has written that the church kind of normalized sort of oppression in society, and that the mental hospitals need to be looked at in that context. And I do think there is legitimacy in that argument. However, I mean, the asylums came from a different start point in a sense. Some of them grew from prisons, some of them grew from workhouses. So they tended to be the so-called non-deserving poor, as it were. And I think that played into it. But I think the church narrative, it certainly doesn't apply to anything like the same extent, in my view, to the mental hospitals the way it does so clearly to other institutions. But that is a really good point from Christina, so I appreciate that.
Okay, thank you. A question from Ruth Hegarty. Brendan, do you think there should be an inquiry into the institutions, and what value would it have?
Well, Ruth, that is a really, really good question about what value such an inquiry would have. I would certainly like to see more examination of them. I would like to see them more prominent in our history. You know, they're prominent in our architecture, in our landscapes, they're prominent, you know, on a population level, but they're just not prominent in the stories we tell ourselves. They're uncomfortable. Most families who had someone in there knew they were in there. They weren't queuing up to bring them home. So in a sense, they're too big. If you like, the network of responsibility is too diffuse. There are so many people involved that it would be a very uncomfortable inquiry. I'm not terribly taken by the model of inquiries, to be entirely honest. I would like to see a systematic re-examination of what happened, what went on from different perspectives. And I guess some of the things that Tanya Dean, I think it was intimating about looking at these through drama, looking at them through fiction, very little fiction about this. I'm collecting up books as they come, but there's very little. People's memoirs commonly skip over it. There are virtually no patient accounts of these institutions that have been published. Hannah Greeley wrote a book called Bird's Nest Soup, and the Reverend Clarence something wrote an extraordinary account of his time in Monaghan. He was clearly very paranoid, but still a very interesting account. Maybe someone can remember his name, Clarence something. But I would like to see more fictional explorations as well. I'm not entirely convinced by the inquiry model as the best way. And this notion that there is an absolute truth to be arrived at also troubles me about that. I would much prefer to see a diversity of explorations of the buildings, the practices, the people, and the outcomes.
Okay, thank you for that. There's two more, and then I think we'll wrap it up. There's Vera, who mentions that in the US, a lot of people with mental illness are very visible on the streets, and what is the best way to deal with such an issue? I suppose maybe she's addressing the issue of, you know, there's institutionalization, but then there's, if you don't do that, then there's a very,
I mean, one of the things that I do talk about a bit in the book is this move from the era of institution to the era of neglect. And how do we fix it there in the middle? I mean, we talk about care in the community, but look, a lot of communities don't care. And every day in my clinical work, I can see how the institutions grew. As a psychiatrist, I am under constant pressure from families, from the police, from all bits of society to admit people into psychiatric hospitals. People who have very sad, difficult stories, but they're not mental illness problems. So I can see both sides of this. Certainly, we could do better with mental health care for homeless people. In Dublin, we do have some teams that go out into homeless hostels and try and follow up people as best as possible. We could do a lot more there. I would like to see a housing first approach to people with homelessness and mental illness. In other words, or to put it another way, if someone has severe psychosis, say severe schizophrenia, I can give them an antipsychotic medication and it will help them a bit. But if that person is sleeping rough, then, I might as well, let's just say it will still help them a bit. But a tablet is no substitute for a roof over your head and a community that values you. So yeah, I can see a mention of the housing first assertive community treatment models here. If they actually happened, I would love to see that, because while I am a psychiatrist and I do believe in the treatments we offer, I'm also a realist. And if someone is sleeping rough, I'm not going to be able to effectively treat their mental illness. I'll try though. I'm not discriminating though, discriminating. Yeah. I'm just saying it's very hard. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that was clear. Finally, a comment and a question from Eileen Quinn. Thank you sincerely. You've left us with so much food for thought. As Grangegorman is reborn, I wonder how we honor the stories in the day-to-day and bring those people with us.
Well, I think the Grangegorman Histories project gets another plug here, which is doing a genuinely multifaceted exploration of the history. And these, I'm very keen that these stories would be retold using the materials available to us, be it the building, the campus, be it the archives, be it the memories of those who remember working there, visiting there, or being in there. I would love to see all of these things retold. I see Aisling there asks, was it Clarence Duffy who wrote the other account of being a patient? And it was indeed Clarence Duffy, a very, very interesting figure who wrote an account of being in a psychiatric hospital in Monaghan in the 1930s. And we've Hannah Greeley's account of Mullingar, but very little else. And Aisling has kindly put in the website grangegormanhistories.ie, which we strongly urge everybody to check out.
Okay, well, I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much for your generosity, the giving of your time and the preparation for this, and being so articulate, because that's exactly what this is about, is trying to bring those stories with us. And make sure that we know where we came from. I mean, here we are in Grangegorman, and what we're trying to do with our project is exactly that, sort of tell these stories and acknowledge what went before as we move forward. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
People. We like applause. Okay, and please join us next week again at 5 p.m. for Brian Donnelly from the senior archivist from the Irish National Archives. We really appreciate it if you could join us for that as well. Thank you again, everyone, and take care.
Thank you.